then I'm going to hand over to Gabrielle. So Gabrielle, thank you very much for joining us and agreeing to run this meetup with us. We really, really are excited. So I'm handing over to you and the team. Thanks again.
Thank you, Miles. And welcome everybody from all around the world. Can't wait to get back to South Africa one day. I love it over there. So I'm joined today by Michael Lachapelle. He's coming from Ottawa, and Kubair Shirazi from also gloomy UK, London. So today we're going to run through, we'll have an introduction so you can go through what this whole Mobius thing is and why we might want to use it. Then I'll give you a very brief example of it in action. Then we're going to run a fun little game. So we'll be using Mural and having an interactive breakout sessions. So that's the plan. And I am going to now go over, get my screen sharing on, and we'll be good to go. Okay, thumbs up. Can you see that, everybody? Should see a giant colorful loop. Brilliant.
Yes, we can.
Okay, so this is a picture of where my children went to school in London for their primary school, and it's an old Victorian building. And this is not unusual in the UK, and Victorian architecture is, it's very, I always think it is very narrow, very sort of longer, narrow rooms, very narrow corridors. And so with that in mind, there's an interesting story by Alistair Parvin, who's an architect. And his firm was brought in by an old Victorian school. And the problem they had was that when the school bell went off, the children would pour into the corridor. It would then be so congested that it would take them a while to get to the next class. And also you found that bullying would break out, fights would break out. So it was a real pain. So after this going on for quite a long time, they decided they needed to fix it. So they'd already put out some bids to get some estimates back to redesign the school. So what they wanted to do was do an extension, a renovation, make the corridors a lot wider. And this was going to cost about £20 million. So Alistair and his team took this, and of course, what you normally do is, again, work out the plans, put in your own bid, and off you go. But they didn't do that. They stepped back and they thought about the problem. So the problem is when the school bell goes off, everybody pours out. You've got this congestion problem. What do you do about it? And they said, well, you know what, let's run a little experiment. So they went to the hardware store, and instead of having one school bell, they bought a bunch of individual smaller bells. And they put them in each classroom. And they said to the teachers, you can push the bell at the end of the lesson on the hour. And so they did. And of course, no one does that all at the same time. Instead, oh, hang on, someone, Michael, could you mute everybody? I'm getting some.
Can you switch off your microphone, please?
Come on.
I've unmuted myself. How's that working out? Otherwise, everybody just push mute. Thank you. Okay, so that the teachers are all, of course, finishing the conversation. No one's going to be directly on time. So they push the school bells individually. Everybody comes out at slightly different staggered times, and the problem's solved. So you solved what was a £20 million problem for something like, you know, £750. And I often feel that in the world we come from, many people are in things like software, but it doesn't really matter what we're building. It feels like we're all constantly busy doing many things. The equivalent of coming up with these elaborate solutions when actually maybe there's a simpler way to get to the outcomes that matter. And to deal with that, I think there's a lot of pressure, even in the pandemic. You know, we have this constant need to deliver more. So in the old days, it used to be about delivering to set milestones, function points, lines of code built. And then we shifted in the Agile world to things like story points, measuring velocity, cycle times. And what that does when you pretty much get what you measure, you end up with a lot more and a lot more outputs. And if you think that this is a good thing to measure, then I always use the example that I love of the TV remote control. So if we think more outputs is a good idea, that would be the equivalent of adding more and more buttons, excuse me, to our remote control. And I don't know about you, but that seems to be the opposite of a good user experience. And the next picture pretty much sums up what I think is the most brilliant UX hack. So this is a guy who went to his grandmother's place, and when he was visiting her, she kept getting up to change the TV channel. And he was like, well, why don't you use the remote control in front of you? And she said, it's just too complicated. I can't use it. So obviously, being a UX genius, he fixed the problem. And this is what I call removing the inessential so the essential can speak. So if we look at any of our products out there, there's probably an awful lot of stuff we don't really need. And what that does is it makes it so complex, so difficult to get to the things we do need. So the idea is to really try to get the essential outcomes that matter rather than all the inessential features, the things that cost a lot of time and effort to get these outputs out the door. And to help with this, companies will adopt the latest, greatest framework. You know, we've gone from sort of Scrum, Agile, Lean, then you end up with Lean Startup, Lean UX, Lean, I don't know, do your dishes. Then we go into the scaling frameworks, the latest, greatest, and there's more and more of these each day. And what I find is that there's all the frameworks, there's a lot that are fantastic, but they do different jobs. So what I call the more discovery, strategy discovery type approaches, business model design, design thinking, Lean UX and things, they're great, but there is a risk. I find they can be seen as a one-off workshop, or you can get stuck in this discovery mode. On the flip side, something that being an Agile meetup, we're all pretty familiar with, is we can bring in these things like Scrum, Agile, Kanban, and they're seen as a way to deliver features rapidly. Now, that's not what they should be used for, or not only, but it's often what I think many people buy them, more features faster. And the risk there is that we can do that, but we're just building the wrong thing faster. So that's not the game we're after. What we want to do is to create balance. So to do that, there's some key activities we go around. When I do this with people to get this thinking of balance between discovering what is the right thing we want to build and then to deliver it rapidly, we'll go around some key activities. So, you know, to turn up to coming from a very agile background, I'd sometimes be pulled in, you have to do this training. And I've got people going, great, love the training. That's fantastic. Right, tomorrow we're going to start our first sprint. And you're like, great, what are you going to be building? And there's just silence. And they're like, oh, well, don't worry about it. We're agile, so we'll figure it out as we go. Now, that can be a pretty wasteful exercise. We might get there, but it's going to take us a lot more effort and cost to do. So we always want to ask this question, why are we doing it? Who are we doing it for? Then, rather than just assuming things, we want to go out and do our discovery. And I'm a big fan of rapid discovery, guerrilla, get our whole teams out into the field to see this firsthand. This helps us then create our outcomes. And I am a fan of measurable outcomes. Not that the numbers are so important, but as soon as you have to quantify and clarify, it pushes on you to make sure that you've done some research, gathered some data. So it's a way of driving clarity. Then when we get into what we call the options pivot, this is where we generate our ideas. So we say, okay, based on the problems we're seeing and the data and the outcomes we want to improve upon, here are the ideas. These are what I call options rather than the traditional requirements. When you say requirements, people think, oh, they're required, we must build them. I like to say, well, it's a giant list of guesses. These are things we think might help us achieve the outcomes, but until we validate and test them, we don't know. So the way that we do that is we refine them into something more tangible that we can do the least amount to test out an idea. So for example, if I think I have an idea that's pretty good, I say, well, what's the least amount that will validate it? And that could be, I do a bit of research, right? Maybe there's something there that if I don't, a threshold, if I don't achieve it within a certain budget or something, that's not worth doing. I run a quick experiment. Can I do something that can test this out rather than the equivalent of that TV remote control where I push all those buttons out, they're stuck there forever. So Agile has a tendency to allow us to build a lot rapidly, but that's dangerous, right? Just because we can doesn't mean we should. Instead, we want to validate these ideas so we don't create more complexity in our products. So options is all about figuring out what it is we want to do. And as we're heading into delivery, we're going to work out how we make that concrete. What are the actions? Then we do our prioritization. And that's really based on what do we think is going to have the biggest impact on our outcomes versus the effort to do it. Around on the right, you're going to be pretty familiar, so I won't spend so much time there, but this is where we deliver experiments. We're measuring against our target outcomes. So we often create very visual trackers. I'm big on creating a visual language. The more fun and simple this is, the more you'll get people engaged in it. And we learn. This is a continuous learning loop. So as we go around, we're not only improving our products, our strategy, our services, but how we're doing that work. So I like to think of this like a race car track. You're going to have some cars on the left doing discovery, some are racing around the right. And you'll find at the beginning, you're probably doing a bit more left looping. As you go through, you can get caught in the right loop. And I notice when this is getting adopted, people start changing the conversation into, that was a good idea, but do we need to do a bit more left loop discovery? Or, hey guys, are we getting too stuck in doing? Are we just pushing out outputs? Do we need to do a bit more step back and look at the outcomes again? And this brings us to what we call our, in the decision pivot, this is where we adapt. We decide, do we go back around the right loop? Do we go back on the left loop or pivot and do something different again? And what it does, this is a meta model. So what it does is it aggregates, it pulls together a lot of the frameworks and tools we know and love, and we can be neutral. I'm very framework and tool agnostic. I think there's values and many of them, and there's many ways we can approach this. And I fully believe that we're thinking people and thinking organizations, and it's up to us to sort of customize and innovate and keep playing with the model itself. So we have, in our toolkit, I think there's over 180 different practices we have, and there's many more. Because what this is really helping us do, we have this idea of having an emergency strategy. So we're constantly improving our strategy, connecting it with rapid delivery. And this is something that we can apply that pattern. It's a universal pattern we can apply, be it to working out our organizational strategy, products, services, operations. I mean, we have people using this in life coaching. So they're doing their own life hacking to make decisions, which is pretty cool. And people who have adopted it, companies like Red Hat, they started off using it for their innovation labs for all their clients. So, it could be aerospace, banking, many things that they do. Then they use it for their own organization. Because Mobius at its core, to make it more adoptable, the core navigator itself and the maps are all open source. So we wanted to lower the barrier to entry. And this one, Kuber, come off mute for a second. What's this a picture of?
Well, this picture's grown. This is Peace Through Prosperity. We've been using Mobius for just under a little bit around a decade to enable and empower micro entrepreneurs in Pakistan and Yemen, and very soon in Ghana.
That's great. And we had a Qatar Consortium article, but we will be doing a webinar with Kuber to go through his model. He's just doing fantastic things. He's so incredibly humble. But I mean, this is really changing people's lives in a very dramatic way. These are the maps I was telling you about. We're going to be, when I show you the case study, the very quick one, this is what we use. So as a, I still get my hands dirty all the time. If I don't do this myself, I become that theoretical, hideous trainer where I start making up things and justifying my weird theory. But as soon as I use it with clients, I'm like, oh yeah, that's a good point. So when I go into sort of coaching engagements, I just pull out these maps, throw them on a mural, and they really help me get the whole picture end to end. So we run these half-day workshops where you go from the why all the way through to the how. I mean, my idea is I don't want people getting stuck in one part of the loop. So we come up with the ideas, and it's all about what can we do this week that will deliver to the outcomes, but make it really, really clear why we're doing it. So it's that connection that matters. And I like the idea that all of us have many tools we like. You know, as I said, we're very neutral about it, and we create our own journeys. I always think of us almost as cocktail makers, right? Mixologists. So we go into organizations and we have our little toolkit with the different things we use, and this gives us a structure to be able to design our own customized process. And as you can see, each of these, I'm going to call them practices, methods, they fit into the map, so they give you that guidance. So this is just a really fun way to help you innovate and bring it into organizations. So just quickly, any questions before I jump into the brief walkthrough of using this? What questions do you have? And feel free to ask it live. You could put it in chat, but it might be better live.
All fine here.
Wow, okay. That's unusual. It's one of those signals. Either I did a really good job of explaining it, or you're going, what? Okay. So this is one of the earliest Mobius. I'm going to show you this just because it's a sort of simple one to get your head around. And why I find many people talk about flashy, fun startups, a lot of us are working in really legacy systems, and you know, we've just got to get through dealing with this. But what was interesting about this one, we'll start with Mobius Loop, so while we're doing it. So what had happened is that Ahus Health municipality in Denmark, they had commissioned they use this really a patient portal and platform for managing patient care. And in this case, it was for aged elder citizens. And when they originally built it, they did it with a very traditional contract model, put it out with fixed price, fixed scope, had it built. And while it met the contractual obligations, it was awful to use. So whenever they wanted to change anything, it took months of delay. It was really expensive to do that. Everybody hated using it. So you can often end up with things that functionally work, but the user experience is dire. So they just wanted to replace the whole thing. And so when we discovered what was really going on, we went out. So instead of, with this contract model, I think about 2/3 of it was really mandatory things you need out of the box as a platform, but 1/3 was not set down at all. Instead, we wanted to generate the outcomes as we went and test against them. So that became the whole outcome-driven way of delivering this. So this is taking the teams out to get data. So there's a lot of surveying you can do to figure out what people are really using when you have an existing system, and to go out and watch the people interacting with it themselves. And this had been, you know, they have good user experience research. The two women in the front had just gotten back from a field trip. So they'd gone out with the caregivers to go to someone's house to watch what was happening. But you see the guy sitting down, he's the architect, Jesper, and the guy standing up on the left is the product owner, Torben. Now, we went from this idea of decoupled sort of research. You get people going into the field, bringing it back, but I don't find that builds as much empathy. So I got them to do the storytelling technique to walk through the problems, really a mini Mobius walkthrough of the journey map. And then the next day, the architect started to do the debrief. Then the next week, they started to bring people from the team out to the field. So this gave us really good data on what were people really struggling with, not a functional set, but a very customer focused set. And this is Espan, my favorite program manager in the world. He's like the perfect leader. So what Espan did is when they awarded the contract to the supplier, Systematic, he actually moved his whole team from the health municipality to go and sit with the supplier. So they work side by side with him. He's a guy who's really busy. And I said, oh, so what's your day job look like, Espan? And he said, well, actually, I gave up all my responsibilities because my job is to walk around and be available. If anyone needs help, I'm going to help them. So an awesome guy. And when he started this, he said for many years, suppliers had told him you need to be more outcome focused. So he created an interesting request for proposal where it was all about how will you help us deliver the outcomes? So if you look there, there were 6 main outcomes. I've mentioned 3 here. They had a lot of technical issues. So he said, we want 0 problems, happy citizens, and happy carers. Now, I'm going to stop sharing for 1 second. You've got a customer who says this to you. We want happy customers. So everybody, just take a minute and think about if you have to then create a contract around happy customers, how would you measure happy? And when you have some ideas, put them into the chat, okay? And there's no good or bad or anything else, just throw them into the chat. How would you measure happy customers? Okay, Net Promoter Score, customer satisfaction survey. Zero complaints, interviews, get the job
I'd want
done.
to be one of these customers. If I really want to be one of the customers, then that's a very good sign.
They keep using your products. Do you have to measure it? If you did, in terms of whether they want to continue as a customer, direct feedback, customer retention, positive customer reviews. Okay. Yeah, a lot of good ideas in there, recurring business. And I like that actually, often people can be sort of immediate. You know, NPS is one that we'll jump to quickly, but it's also good looking at those longer types of outcomes. In this case, when we look at this, go back to my screen. If you can look over to the right, it might be so small, but whenever I get these sort of questions, my first question is, well, if you ask for happy, that presupposes that people are unhappy. So why are people unhappy? How many people? Why are they unhappy? And this is something I learned as a trainer many years ago. For example, when you say, how effective are you as a trainer? Well, let's get our Net Promoter Score. Let's get our happiness satisfaction score. You know, as a trainer, if you run a really fun exercise right at the end of the class, things like the XP game with fun balloons and things, your score will go up by a few points. However, is that the right thing we want to measure? In this case, you know, you probably want to measure, did they actually learn something? So with this, what these kinds of outcomes and structuring them is telling us, and this is where we'll often go back around the discovery loop, is what's behind this? What's the data? So the outcomes will help drive our understanding. It'll get us into, you know, I saw people mention things like complaints, and we want to see if these are these unhappiness metrics, can we bring those down? So the whole contract and how this was driven was all about outcomes, right? Making sure that we could, when we say zero problems, how would we measure that? Getting a lot of clarity. And out of that, you can then generate ideas. So just a really simple one. For example, let's say in the discovery, it took a long time to create a customer report. After doing our discovery work, there are a lot of hypotheses based on what we'd observed. For example, information across multiple pages, slow to load, login failure. And out of that, we can start breaking it down. So for all of these things, I like to use a little acronym, RED, research, experiment, or deliver. So we always say, what's the least amount we can do to achieve the outcomes? And the outcomes might be, well, learning. What can we do to learn really rapidly? If it's something that we've already validated, or it's sort of a no-brainer, there's no risk, no complexity we're adding, then we deliver it. So in this case, usually we're breaking things down to a lot of research experiments and things we can deliver. Then we prioritize. There's Kubert doing this little prioritize options map. So this is looking at the impact of our options against the outcomes we're trying to achieve. Then we go into delivery. This was their kind of high-level roadmap. So a bit of reverse engineering, saying by this date, what are the key pieces? So we're getting into very agile land here. They were using a combination of Kanban, Scrum, things like that. Under their measurement, there were a lot of things we were measuring. This is one of the experiment cards. It's probably too hard to read. But for example, the number of successful citizen history reports, number of times users had to look up help, times to complete, and then looking at how much impact we're making as we're going around. And this is a lot of information thrown at you, but this is a simplified version. It's what we call the sort of ultimate Kanban. This is your end-to-end view, so you can see how it's all flowing across the board. Okay, I'm going to stop there because we want to have time for the game, but any questions before we move into the game?